channel. I am going, what am I talking about? What is this video today? Okay, someone's hyper. Anyway, hello world, welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to bring you a video that is very academic. Today we're going to talk a little bit about books that will help you understand yourself better, i.e. my top psychology references and texts and things. Now, disclaimer, I did study cognitive science and psychology in undergrad. That was my major. So most of these are going to be pretty academic. That said, obviously, like textbooks and things like that are really expensive. So I'm going to do my best to incorporate articles that you can find on Google Scholar and things like that, and also books that are actual physical books that are meant for the general public that are written by some of these psychologists and things like that. So we're gonna start with just like some general texts. Wow, texts is a really hard word for me to say today, that are really great for an introduction to things like developmental psychology and cognitive psychology and psycholinguistics, because that's a personal interest of mine. And then we're going to get into a little bit more depth about some specific researchers who personally I think have some very interesting research, and I feel like a lot of their research is easily applicable to real life and to your life. So we're just gonna hop right in. Let's start with a discussion on textbooks. So many of the textbooks, obviously, that we have today and that we have to use for classes and things like that can be really expensive, like upwards of $200, which is ridiculous. But there tend to be ways that you can get them in PDF form, you can rent them, you can grab them from a library. If you have access to a university library, that's a really good way to get access to these sorts of things. And I want to talk about specifically 3 major textbooks that were sort of introductory texts, introductory books that are a really good way of getting a global look at specifically cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, and cognitive linguistics and psycholinguistics. So to begin, let's go with cognitive psychology. So in general, in the world of psychology, you have a ton of different fields of psychology. It is a gigantic world of psychology. But specifically, cognitive psychology studies your cognition. Specifically, it's a lot more focused on decisions and decision processes. It's less focused on things like clinical psychology. With a general cognitive psychology class, you're thinking more about thinking specifically. So it's the psychology of how we think. I specifically used this text in my first cognitive psychology class, which is called Cognitive Psychology: Connecting Mind, Research, and Everyday Experience. And I personally found it really useful because it talks about everything from how we think about decisions, how our memory works, how our emotions affect our thinking, what we know about dreams, all of these different things. And so if you're looking for kind of a general introduction into just how we think, this book in particular I found to be pretty accessible, really great. Obviously, most of these textbooks that I'm talking about, I was being taught in a lecture format alongside of them, but I did enjoy this one for sure. Let's shift gears a little bit away from cognitive psychology and get into an intro text for developmental psychology. So I have a personal soft spot in my heart for developmental psychology and developmental linguistics because that was like my main focus in my undergrad career. I wrote a thesis on developmental linguistics and all these sorts of things. So a great text that I really enjoyed for my first developmental psychology class was called The Developing Person Through the Lifespan. And I really enjoyed this book because oftentimes in developmental psychology, you will get a very intense focus on growing up and ages normally from like birth till about 18 or 25, depending on the range that you're wanting to look at. But I really like this text in particular because it goes beyond that. It goes into what it's like to be in your early 20s and then beyond, what it's like in general to be in your 30s, what it's like to be a parent if you choose to be a parent, what it's like to grow older, be empty nesters, and have grandchildren, and what it's like for you psychologically to be in retirement and to have less abilities of your body and things like that. And so it is a very, very great text if you want to generally look at what it's like to grow and what it is like to live a life. I personally thought that it had a lot of interesting things to say, like I said, about older life and specifically about happiness. There are some really interesting discussions and chapters in this book on what it means to live a happy life and the different things that people have found to correlate with happiness overall in your life. The next book that I want to talk about is just an introduction to psycholinguistics text that I used in my psycholinguistics class. So psycholinguistics is specifically basically how our psychology and the way we think is affected by the languages that we speak and vice versa. So psycholinguistics and cultural linguistics go very closely hand in hand. There are many different ways that people think that are affected by the languages that they speak, i.e. the way that languages are structured sometimes has to do with how a culture thinks. Different words are available for cultures in which those words are necessary but may not be words in other languages and things like that. So really, really interesting, fascinating stuff if you're interested in languages but also want it to focus not too much just heavily on grammar and just focus on how we think about language as well. So the book that I would recommend as an intro text for this is Introduction to Psycholinguistics, Understanding Language Science. So yeah, it goes everything from talking a little bit about the processing systems in our brain and which brain centers are responsible for language knowledge and things like that in general. And it goes from that all the way to what happens if there's any sort of damage to your brain, so like Wernicke's area and things like that. It talks all about famous cases of people who have damage to their brain and how that changes their linguistic centers. It also goes into cultural linguistics, like I was saying. For instance, I believe in Russian, there's like 4 or 5 or 6 different words for the color blue, and it's not something like adjective blue, like cerulean blue, where we would have that in English. They actually have specific different words, and in a single word, the actual shade of the blue is inferred through the single word. And so they talk about why that would be. Why is this such an important thing? There are also different words for snow in areas that tend to get more snow, whereas in languages where you would not find snow in that sort of environment, there's normally very little words having to do with snow and ice and cold and things like that. So super interesting if you have any sort of interest in how language and linguistics can be applied to your thought processes as a human. There's also another good text that focuses specifically on developmental psychology for younger ages. I believe this text goes up from like 0 to 18, I think it is, and that one is just called Children's Thinking, Cognitive Development, and Individual Differences. That talks specifically about children and different cognitive checkpoints that you can see in developing children and different ways in which children can develop and how their environments and things like that may affect the way they develop. So if you're interested specifically in developmental psychology, you could also kind of like add that one to the list. All right, so now that we've gotten those textbook discussions out of the way, I would like to shift now into a general chat about some modern researchers that I think are really interesting and doing really interesting work. I actually only have 3 researchers here right now, and that is just because I wanted to focus on specifically cognitive psychology and developmental psychology and also psycholinguistics. And so with each of those sections that I was just talking about with text, I kind of chose one researcher that I thought was personally doing some interesting work. The reason that I want to talk to you about the researcher is because you can actually go to their profile on Google Scholar and see all of their publications, and depending on if you're associated with an institution or a university or anything like that, you can get those for free, or you can rent them, or if you have a subscription to any sort of academic services or anything like that, you can always get them that way as well. Otherwise, you can always just search the title of the article that you find and then put PDF in the browser if you're looking on Google or something like that, and oftentimes you'll be able to find some sort of PDF version. Let's start with developmental psychology, and specifically a little bit of developmental cognitive psychology, and we're going to talk about Carol Dweck. So Carol Dweck is a researcher who has become extremely famous for the study of mindset and how the way that you think about things and the way that you interpret things can change your general success and your general outcomes in life. So Carol Dweck has released a lot of different articles and studies and things over the years, but mostly she churns out books like crazy. And I have two of her actual written books that are for the general public that I really want to talk about today. So one of them is called Mindset, The New Psychology of Success. And in this book, it talks about her major research. So Carol Dweck is extremely famous in the psychology world and in the general world as well, like the TED Talk world, for two specific ideas. So she talks about mindset in terms of a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. And Carol Dweck kind of asserts that there are two ways in which your mind can be shaped by the way that you think. And if you have a growth mindset, meaning that you are excited about challenges, you're willing to try new things, you view your intelligence as something that is fluctuating, you view your abilities as something that can fluctuate, and the intelligence and abilities of other people as things that are changeable and fluid. So with this sort of mindset, she asserts and has found that in general, you tend to have a little bit more success in life in many different areas, just because you are less scared of failure. You view failure as something where you can grow from it. It's something that is a teaching moment. It doesn't change anything about your identity. However, a fixed mindset, if you have a fixed mindset, it is something where you focus more on your smarts. So instead of thinking, oh yeah, I had to work really hard for that and I'm really proud of myself because of the work that I put in, you would think, oh yeah, I'm just good at this. This is just something that I am naturally good at. I didn't have to study, I didn't have to study for that test. It's a very typical fixed mindset sort of situation. The idea that you're just born with intelligence, you either can do it or you can't, period. If you're good at it, you can do it. If not, then you can't do it. Period. This sort of fixed mindset tends to meld the idea of intelligence and ability with your identity as a person very strongly, which means that if you ever fail or you have a setback or something that's particularly challenging, instead of taking it as an opportunity for growth, you think of it as something that is threatening your identity and threatening your abilities. So something that I think is really great about this research in particular and about Carol Dweck and the way that she approaches this is that obviously there's kind of like a pro and a con here, but if you have a fixed mindset, you can change that mindset. She also talks a lot about how these mindsets have to do with developmental psychology and how if you ever have kids or if you were growing up and were in an environment where your parents were sort of praising you in different ways, these different sorts of praises can end up correlating with different mindsets. So if you see your child and they did really well on a test or something, and you say, wow, you got an A on that test. I'm so proud of you. You are so smart. That starts to enforce a very fixed mindset. But if you say, wow, I am so proud of how hard you worked on this test. I could really see that you put the effort in and I'm really happy with how hard you worked. That is going to focus more on a growth mindset, meaning that the outcome is not what's important. What's important is that you're working hard and that you are personally interested in that topic or whatever. So anyway, those are some really interesting things about Carol Dweck and that particular research. She also has another book that is called Self-Theories, Their Role in Motivation, Personality, and Development, which focuses a little bit more on like the psychology and cognition of how we can get into those different mindsets. So a self-theory, i.e. an idea of who you are and your idea of who you are and how that will change and affect your life. Whether it's in a growth or fixed mindset, whether it's in your ability to be motivated about things, how your view of yourself changes your personality, things like that. So if you're looking for kind of like an easy breezy psychology read that has some really good backing in professional research, but you don't want to have to like go through an entire research article or an entire textbook, these are two very accessible, really interesting reads that I would highly recommend. Okay, so let's talk about our next researcher who is extremely famous in the world of cognitive psychology, and his name is Daniel Kahneman. So Daniel Kahneman is mostly famous for his work in cognitive psychology and economics and how you can apply decision-making processes from a cognitive psychology perspective to an economics environment. So he has a book that came out in 2011, I believe, that is one of his most popular books and one of the things that he's most famous for, and that is called Thinking Fast and Slow. And in this book, he puts forward his theory of the fact that we have two different systems for thinking. We have a very fast, automatic, heuristic way of thinking, which is very reactionary. And then we have another way of thinking, which is very slow, very intentional, very analytical kinds of thinking. And depending on which sort of method of thinking that we are using, it will change the accuracy of the way that we think about things and our answers. Really interesting about the just psychology of decision making and literally just how we think about things. He is also famous for something called prospect theory, which is kind of similar to that as well. It's some of his earlier work. I actually do have a few research articles of his that I found that I think are pretty interesting and both do a pretty good job at just generally summarizing his work in these different theories. So I will link those down below. If you have a way to gain access from them, that's great. If not, you can just, like I said, try and type in the title and then like PDF or something into a search engine and see what you can find. But yes, his book that his book that I would recommend is Thinking Fast and Slow if you want something that is accessible and meant for the general public, and if you kind of want to get more into the psychology of how we think and specifically how we make decisions. And then the last sort of honorable mention professor that I would like to mention is actually, she was my research professor and my thesis advisor, and her name is Twyla Tardif. And so Twyla is, I'm going to refer to, maybe I should say Professor Tardif, I don't really know. So Twyla focuses mostly on psycholinguistics and developmental psycholinguistics. So how children learn language, basically. And how different language structures and different learning environments can affect our abilities and how quickly we learn language and all of these different things. So Twyla has a very extensive Google Scholar profile, and she does a lot of work specifically with different languages. So Twyla, one of her most interesting works, and she has been cited in many different textbooks for this work and this sort of thing, is looking at what different types of emphasis people put on different types of words when they're teaching. Let me explain. So if you are an English speaker and you are teaching your child English, and you are, say you're a mom or a dad and you're using baby talk and you're saying super cute things, and you say, this is a ball, like say you're playing catch with them or something, you say ball, this is a ball, and the kid will eventually learn the word ball. That is a noun-oriented teaching situation. However, in Mandarin, she found that oftentimes, instead of teaching nouns first, Mandarin speakers will teach verbs first. So instead of saying, this is a ball, you would say, look, I'm throwing the ball. I throw the ball. Do you want to throw the ball? And so in creating these different emphases and in creating these different references, this is called a reference. If you point to something or you show something, that's called a reference. And if you reference these things in different ways, children will learn these different languages in different ways. So maybe that's not interesting to everybody. I totally geek out about that, and I wrote my final thesis on something very similar to that. So anyway, yeah, I personally think that stuff is really interesting. I have her main paper for that particular finding that I will link down below as well if you want to read up on it. So yeah, those are the main kind of like general areas of psychology that I am most well versed in. Like I said, I don't know a lot about clinical psychology because that was a very specific path in my undergrad and university, and I didn't really choose that path. I wanted to go more into the decision analytics kind of side of things because, like I said, I'm doing data science now as a master's, and I wanted to do artificial intelligence eventually, which focuses a lot on cognition specifically. So, wow, I am excited about this topic. So I want to leave you with a few books that I find interesting about just kind of ourselves in general and how we can think about a few other ways of the way that we think about things in real life. I don't know if that made sense, but anyway, number one is there have been, I guess 1 and 2, there have been so many popular books recently talking about habits and habit building, habit breaking, habit changing, all of those different types of things, and why as humans it's hard for us to break habits, good habits, bad habits, etc. So there are 2 books floating around the world right now that I know of that are extremely popular that I would like to get into. I haven't actually read these 2 yet, but I have done a lot of research about them and these seem to be really, really great. And that is The Power of Habit and also Atomic Habits. So these 2, I would say, go ahead, grab them, rent them from your library, anything like that if you want to get into habit building and if you want to kind of learn more about how you can effectively change the way that you think and change the way that you live your life through your habits. And then lastly, I have to mention Wherever You Go, There You Are by Jon Kabat-Zinn. This is a little bit less psychology focused and a little bit more health focused, but it talks a lot about stress and anxiety and different ways in which you can approach thinking about the world and thinking about your problems, thinking about what you're grateful for in your situations and things like that. But it's not too religious focused. Not that that's always a bad thing, but I think it's important to recognize that meditation and mindfulness doesn't have to be something that is centered around religion. It can be practiced as an exercise, just like you would go running. So yeah, those are the main things that I wanted to chat about in this video. I hope it was interesting. Let me know if you guys like this sort of academic style video. I will happily make more about different topics that I am well versed in. And if you guys have any recommendations for interesting texts or interesting books or anything like that that you find personally interesting when it comes to understanding yourself and the psychology world, I will happily open up the comments section to you guys. Go wild, go bananas down there. So thank you so much for joining me today, you guys. I hope you enjoyed this video and I will see you in the next one. Bye!